Good morning from Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. I'm Elizabeth. As you know, I coordinate the online course on gender responsive budgeting analysis and strategies from theory to practice. We will finalize this course in 2 weeks, which I guess is both a relief and it may be a stress also for some participants. A relief because you have done a lot of good work, and a little of stress because it's almost time to finalize all the tasks. So as you know, today is our third web conference. We had a first web conference on experiences in Latin America and the Caribbean, a second one on the experience of the city-state of Berlin in Germany. And we will now have an overview of GRB experiences in OECD countries. As you know, OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. If I'm not wrong, 35 countries are members of this organization. So Sherry Nicole is with us, connected. I will present her shortly. She is a policy analyst with the OECD's Budgeting and Public Expenditures Division, where she contributes to the work stream on gender budgeting. She contributed to the preparation of the 2016 report named Gender Budgeting in OECD Countries, based on a comprehensive survey of current practices. And she organized the first OECD experts meeting on gender budgeting in 2017. She also contributes to the OECD network of parliamentarian budget offices and independent fiscal institutions. Mrs. Nicole has a master's degree in applied economics from the University of, I don't know if I can pronounce that, Strathclyde, and started her career as an economist for the Economic Development Agency for the Islands and Islands of Scotland. She moved to the Scottish Parliament in 2008, providing research support to the elected members in areas relating to public finance and the economy. In this role, she has helped set up the Financial Scrutiny Unit and worked on the devolution of increased fiscal powers to Scotland. As usual, our team is also connected. We have Margarita Osonas, who is the moderator of the course, and Stephanie, who supports us. So we would like to thank very much Sherry Nicole for accepting our invitation. Thank you, Sherry, for your time. It's really an honor to come with your presentation today. Before starting, as you know, you can, participants to this webinar can post questions. So you have a blog called Questions, and you can post your questions here. Also, you know that this web conference is recorded, and we will then post it in our YouTube channel, UN Women Training Center. So I give now the microphone to Sherry so she can start her presentation. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you very much, and it's also an honor for me to be here today with you to talk about gender budgeting in OECD countries. So I'll just kick off with my presentation. Just as a background, here at the OECD, we published a recommendation in 2015 to provide governments with a sort of clear and concrete path to make their administrations, their legislatures, and their judiciaries much more cognizant and responsive to the needs of both men and women. This recommendation is called the 2015 OECD Recommendation on Gender Equality in Public Life. And in this, there's a provision which relates to gender budgeting. And it says that governments should consider the integration of the gender perspective in all phases of the budget cycle. And this is really the work stream that I'm taking forward at the moment on behalf of the OECD. So, how can a gender perspective be applied to all key stages of the budget cycle? Well, if we look at the next slide, we can see that the OECD has developed a typology of gender budgeting to help guide governments in this area. It gives an idea of the type of activities and tools that we would expect to see governments applying in order to implement this aspect of the recommendation. So I'll go through this, each of these on an individual basis. Now, the ex ante phase of the budget process, that's the phase before the budget is approved. We really see that governments, this is the phase where governments need to question whether or not they have the tools in place that allow them to have the information on gender needs and gender impact, which will inform resource allocation decisions and the preparation of the government's budget proposal. So we see governments using tools such as gender impact assessments, gender budget baseline analysis, and gender needs assessments, which allow them to obtain a more solid understanding of gender needs and the gender impact of budget proposals in advance of their inclusion in the draft budget. Using these tools helps government target their resources more effectively to bring about improved gender equality. And it can also help ensure that any inadvertent negative gender equality impacts from policy initiatives are identified and avoided. Just to talk a little bit about the tools that we have highlighted here. A gender impact assessment is something where the government would consider the impact of individual policy measures on gender equality. And this type of impact assessment is usually conducted by staff in individual line ministries, and they use this information to help decide whether or not the policy measure is appropriate for inclusion in the budget proposal. A budget baseline analysis is the type of analysis whereby the government would look at the allocation of expenditures and revenues, the baseline allocation, and it would look at the extent to which this allocation has an impact on men and women differently, and it gives an idea of where the gender equality gaps are, and it's the type of analysis that's usually conducted at this sort of central budget authority level. There's also the gender needs assessments, and these are much more substantial qualitative assessments which look at detail at the extent to which existing policies and programs meet and affect gender equality needs in specific policy areas. So some sort of gender needs assessment would help identify the extent to which there are policy needs in different areas such as health and education relating to men and women differently. And these needs assessments are usually conducted at the line ministry, policy or program level on a government-wide basis, or at least at an aggregated policy basis. It's also important that there's gender budgeting tools applied during the budget year. And this is what we call the concurrent tools of gender budgeting. So we would look to see that the government has in place and tools that will help it assess the gender impact of the money that it's spending, and that it transparently publishes any assessment that it undertakes in this area. This transparency element is really important because it helps ensure that citizens are informed about the extent to which the government's using its budget to help deliver improved gender equality. So typically in this phase we would expect to see, for example, budget incidence analysis. This is where the draft budget or the official budget is accompanied by an assessment of the budget's overall impact in promoting gender equality. It might include gender tagging of budget lines according to the extent to which they are targeted towards improving gender equality. It should also ensure there should also be a consideration of the extent to which gender goals are also taken into account in the performance framework that is associated with the budget. And we would really hope to see that there's gender-related objectives integrated in this performance framework so that stakeholders can track the extent to which the government's making progress towards gender equality objectives. For example, in Austria, we see that the provisions in their budgeting framework require the annual budget statement to have outcome objectives with at least one objective in each chapter directly addressing gender equality. There's also the ex post phase, and this is the phase that follows the implementation, the spending of the government's budget. In this phase, the government can use tools such as ex post gender impact assessments, gender audits, and spending review in order to ensure that the expected gender outcomes of the budget were delivered. And lessons from these should feed into future budget decision making to ensure that the effectiveness of spending in achieving gender equality outcomes can be improved over time. A good example of the use of these tools is provided in Spain by the Andalusia region, where the government administration has launched a series of gender audits to assess the degree to which the budget programs have implemented a gender perspective in the budget process, and this has been in place since 2013. So these gender audits now form part of its wider gender budgeting strategy, and they aim to assess the extent to which the objectives assigned to gender equality programs have been attained, and also to identify best practices and make recommendations to strengthen their gender responsive budgeting efforts overall. Of course, these type of gender budgeting tools can only be effective if there's a supportive enabling environment in place within the government. What do I mean by an enabling environment? Well, I'm talking about clear leadership, I'm talking about strong coordination mechanisms between ministries, and I'm talking about ensuring that there's the collection of gender disaggregated data to ensure that there is the information that's necessary to undertake these types of analysis. In addition, stakeholder engagement is a really important part of this gender budgeting framework. Citizen engagement, for example, can ensure that gender-sensitive policy making actually reflects the needs of the population, and parliamentary engagement can ensure that there's oversight of the government's gender budgeting practices and that the government's held to account for its stated objectives in this area. All these, the OECD typology and more detail on it is currently being formulated into a gender budgeting toolkit, which we will be publishing later in the year. Moving on to the next slide, I want to now talk about what we're seeing in terms of gender budgeting efforts across the OECD at the moment. So the OECD conducted a survey in 2016 which helped us identify the various tools and practices and procedures that were in place in different OECD countries, as well as the obstacles, the issues and lessons that countries were facing in this key policy area. I'll present now some of the key findings from our survey, which have been published in our report on gender budgeting. So first of all, we can see that almost half of the OECD's 34 countries, 35 now, but 34 at the time, do gender budgeting, or at least planning and considering it. This is on the next slide. And a lot of this effort has actually been seen to gain momentum in recent years. In particular, in governments such as Sweden, we've seen increased efforts in countries such as Iceland as well. And I think that even since this survey was undertaken last year, we've seen we've seen increased interest in gender budgeting in some of the countries where at the time it was not planned. For example, Canada, where there's now a feminist government, they're increasing their efforts towards gender budgeting, and I know that Ireland, for example, are another country that's considering increasing its efforts in this area. So there's a certain degree of momentum that can be identified towards gender budgeting within OECD countries at the moment. And so we'd be expecting to see the next time we undertake this survey that around half of OECD countries will be doing gender budgeting. Why is there a momentum? Well, in the next slide, you'll see that essentially there's just continuing perception of gender inequalities, and that's really the key driver. It is the continued inequality that is being seen across OECD countries that is driving governments to increase efforts in this area. And so it's pretty simplistic in that sense. But in terms of the approaches to gender budgeting, in the next slide you'll see that while there's consistency in the sort of rationale for introducing gender budgeting, there's very much differentiation in the way in which governments deliver it. And so we've listed the various tools that I spoke about earlier, and we show you the extent to which different gender budgeting countries use these tools, and you can see that there's quite a variety, in fact. While tools such as anti-gender impact analysis are quite prevalent and quite heavily used, and there's often a gender perspective in performance setting and resource allocation, at the other end of the scale we see that actually after the money's been spent there's very little assessment of whether or not it was effective in achieving its gender equality aims. And at the same time it's much less common to see governments undertaking gender needs assessment, the type of assessment whereby they look at the gender disaggregated data in a specific policy area and decide and use that information to decide how best to develop policy in that area. So really seeing a differentiated approach across OECD countries at the moment. And we try to categorize the approaches into sort of 3 different broad categories of gender budgeting approach, which you'll see on the next slide. So these are cumulative in the sense that we see that countries that have got that are doing gender budgeting but are maybe doing more light touch gender budgeting, they would typically be doing ex-ante gender impact assessments, and maybe they would have a gender perspective in resource allocation and performance setting, but they wouldn't be going on to use the other tools. And these are countries like Belgium, like Japan, like Finland. And we call this group of countries the countries that do gender-informed resource allocation. And it's really about using gender information to improve the resource allocation and the extent to which it reduces inequalities. The next group of countries have got much stronger efforts in terms of the extent to which they assess how the overall budget impacts gender equality in their country. And this group of countries includes Iceland, Israel, Korea, Spain, Sweden. And we see these countries, for example, doing gender budget baseline analysis and also gender budget incidence analysis, as well as some of them also doing ex post gender impact assessments. So moving on to that sort of phase where after the money's been spent, trying to understand the extent to which it's effectively achieved its goals. And a number of those countries also do gender audit of the budget. The next group of countries are the countries that are really more thorough in their gender budgeting practice. And we call this the needs-based gender budgeting group. And All of these countries undertake gender and needs assessment as part of their gender budgeting practice, and this is what defines these countries. And that needs assessment really helps underpin an effective gender budgeting strategy. So we see countries like Austria, Mexico, Netherlands and Norway in this group. So you can see there's a variety of approach, and there's also different scales of gender budgeting that countries can do. Gender budgeting is still a tool that a lot of countries are grappling with, and the survey helped us identify some of the challenges that the countries are facing. The next slide shows the first of those challenges, and it's the limited availability of gender disaggregated data. In particular, if you're going to undertake needs-based analysis, you really need to have good gender disaggregated data at the country level. And this chart shows that there's very few countries which identified as having significant data available to inform their gender budgeting practices, with most countries just saying that they had sector-specific data available. Another key challenge is that the evidence of the actual impact of gender budgeting is still quite limited. You'll see from this chart that most countries are still saying that they've just got sector-specific evidence of gender budgeting having an impact on improving gender outcomes, with a number of countries still saying that they've got either insufficient information or not significant evidence of the actual impact of gender budgeting. I think one of the reasons for this is that it's still a relatively new tool, and the assessment of its impact is relatively undeveloped. So this is an area where we would expect to see progress in forthcoming years. But just to give you an idea of some of the impacts that countries have identified at the moment, the next slide provides some country examples. For example, in Iceland, the country reported that the tools of gender budgeting that they introduced have already helped identify and avert a new tax proposal relating to income tax that was the aim to simplify the income tax system. However, analysis actually found that the tax proposals as they were presented would create a bigger gender income gap. And in addition, the joint taxation would only benefit higher income families, further promoting inequality. Thanks to this information, the tax proposal was actually amended by the Budget Committee. So that's a good example of how gender budgeting practice has helped avoid a tax proposal being put forward that would have promoted gender inequality. In the Netherlands, we saw that the inclusion of gender indicators in the monitoring framework has increased the availability of gender disaggregated data, and that's a really important impact that the Netherlands has identified there as part of their gender budgeting practice. Korea has also identified a number of impacts from its practice. In particular, they believe that the gender budgeting practices have increased the gender equality awareness of its government officials. In Spain, they've seen improvements in a number of policy areas as a result of their gender budgeting practices. Like they've seen increased policies to promote and protect families, and also other policies which have helped overcome inequalities. Similarly, in Japan, there's been measures introduced as a result of gender budgeting which have helped reduce maternity harassment in the workplace. And Mexico too have reported that in the education sector, New programs have been introduced as a result of their gender budgeting practice, and these programs provide scholarships for women in careers that were previously only considered suitable for men. So you can see the type of impact that we're seeing is really at the policy level. I think that one of the key concerns we have at the moment is that it would be really useful to have a better grip of the extent to which gender budgeting is having an impact on gender equality outcomes. So, you know, the key headline indicators in relation to gender equality in certain countries, and also the extent to which closing the gender gap is then leading to improved social and economic outcomes for the country. So although we do have some evidence of impact, this is definitely an area of improvement. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that one of the reasons we have still got such limited knowledge of the impact of gender budgeting is that the tools that countries are using to assess impact are largely focusing on gender indicators. So gender indicators is part of their performance framework. And really there's very limited use of sort of civil society dialogue and stakeholder surveys that will give a much greater in-depth understanding of the extent to which gender budgeting practices are making a difference in the day-to-day lives of men and women. Another challenge that has been identified is the need for complementary and coordinated institutional roles in the area of gender budgeting. The next slide, you will see that there's really quite a lot of key actors involved in gender budgeting as a policy area. In particular, you've got the Ministry of Finance, who typically have a strong leadership role in this area, but there's also the Ministry of Welfare or Equality that would have a strong interest in driving this agenda. And you also need the line ministries on board, because you need to ensure that when they're undertaking their policy development, they're taking into account gender needs. And then the oversight institutions who need to be checking that the gender budgeting is being done effectively and need to be checking the promised outputs are being delivered, as well as civil society, who are really important in terms of feeding into information into the gender budgeting process. So there's really a lot of key actors that need to be involved in gender budgeting, and that's one of the challenges. And it's another area that we see a really differentiated approach across OECD countries. The next slide will show some country examples where a centralized and a decentralized leadership model are compared. So in Korea, for example, the Ministry of Strategy and Finance is the main responsibility for driving gender budgeting. But in Germany, individual sector-based ministries are fully responsible for gender equality policies within their areas of authority. So you really see the leadership model being significantly different in different countries. Another way in which the institutional arrangements differ for gender budgeting is the institutional coordination. For example, because it requires a lot of coordination, it's important that there's coordination mechanisms, but we see these coordination mechanisms being quite different. So in Spain, there's a gender budgeting working group which consists of representatives from the Ministry of Health, Social Services and Equality, and the Office of the Secretary for State for Budgets and Expenditure, and the Directorate General of Budgets. And this budget working group takes forward the gender budgeting practice in Spain. But in Iceland, on the other hand, it's the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Equality who work together to prepare the gender budgeting programme. So the coordination models are quite different. Another way in which the institutional arrangements differ is the extent to which that there's stakeholder involvement in gender budgeting practices. We think it's very important that there's external stakeholder involvement in gender budgeting. Two examples of where this is done quite well are in Morocco and Sweden. In Morocco, the government regularly communicates with civil society and stakeholders in the area of gender budgeting. And they have interagency groups which exchange good practices. Expert groups are also asked for their advice, and there's a dialogue between civil society and the government in this area. Also in Sweden, there's a women's lobby, which is an independent umbrella organisation which helps analyse the state budget bill from a gender equality perspective, and this is a key part of the gender budgeting landscape in Sweden. And so this citizen engagement is a really important part of gender budgeting, and how that is done and how that's executed is a really important thing for countries to consider. So I've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the different practices, some of the different challenges, and some of the different types of arrangements that we're seeing in OECD countries. The last thing I'd like to just talk about briefly is the sort of future studies for gender budgeting. What sort of issues and questions do we have going forward as a result of everything we know so far? Well, I think there's a few things that we are clear that would help make gender budgeting work better. In particular, improved provision of gender disaggregated data. Having gender disaggregated data by default would certainly help countries undertake better gender budgeting needs-based analysis to inform policy development and to make policies much more targeted in the area of delivering gender equality. Also, I think that understanding, having gender indicators integrated into the performance framework is really important. And so ensuring that there's a link between gender budgeting and performance budgeting is also an integral part of having an effective gender budgeting framework. It's also really important that all the efforts in gender budgeting are very open and transparent and inclusive. So we're talking about analysis being made public, we're talking about stakeholder engagement and communication. And it's only by having this sort of transparency that there can be true accountability in practice like gender budgeting. There's still some areas where we need to improve efforts. One of those is definitely in assessing the impact of gender budgeting on delivering gender equality outcomes and the wider social and economic ramifications of that. And also moving from the gender budgeting focusing on budget lines which are very obviously related to gender equality, such as, for example, domestic abuse, to thinking about the gender impact of less obvious budget lines. For example, what is the gender impact of spending on bridges? And, moving forward from the typical gender analysis towards this non-obvious gender analysis is critical in terms of moving forward in the gender budgeting practices. And I think that finally, I would say that another challenge going forward is just ensuring that gender budgeting isn't a fad, isn't a new something that adds to the administrative burden of annual budgeting, but it's something that's instead embedded in the annual budgeting process. It's not just seen as a tick box exercise, but it's something that becomes very much integrated in the thinking of budget managers and the ministries of finance when they're thinking about their annual budget process. And by making improvements in these areas, we can hopefully make improvements in reducing gender inequalities across the OECD. So that's my whistle-stop tour of gender budgeting in OECD countries, and I welcome any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it was very interesting. While I'm giving the screen to Stephanie so that she can, sorry, so that she can share the questions. I have one question. You were speaking about. Do you have an idea of what sectors or in which sectors GRB is mostly done? I mean,
Yes, we
health or
do.
education or, and you were speaking
Yeah,
about other sectors that maybe are less obvious. That could be
yeah.
interesting.
So certainly where we're seeing that gender budgeting has stimulated the adoption of policy developments or policy changes most so far is in areas like education and the labour market, as well as income inequality, welfare, childcare, family care, citizen security. I think these are probably not surprising for any of you in terms of they're the most obvious where there are large gaps, persistent gaps between genders in performance in these areas. Health is another area where we're seeing that gender budgeting is stimulating the adoption of sort of new policy developments. So I think these are typically the policy areas where it's being most effective so far. And I think the other policy areas are the ones which have yet to develop more advanced practice in this area. So yes, as you suspect, things like, defence, the things like transport, things like foreign policy development. There's all sorts of other policy areas which where it's less common to apply a gender perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I see there are a lot of questions. I have one, but I will post it. So I give the floor to Stephanie. Stephanie? Sorry.
Hello.
Yes, now.
Hi.
Hello. I'll begin with our first question. Do you know why only few countries use gendered needs assessment and spending review? Is it due to commitment or capacities?
It's a really good question, and actually I think it's different for both tools. For gender needs assessment, I really think that one of the key constraints is the availability of gender disaggregated data. In order to do a needs assessment in a specific policy area, you need to have the data on men and women in that area. For example, if you're thinking about a bridge and you want to do a gender needs assessment in relation to, for example, transport arrangements, you have to understand, okay, how do men and women use transport differently in the country in order for us to understand what the needs of men and women are in this area. And there's actually very little gender disaggregated data in these kind of niche policy areas at the moment. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are seeing more developments in policy areas such as education and the labour market, because really there's more gender data in these types of policy areas than there are in some others. So I think that that's a key constraining factor in relation to gender needs assessment. In terms of spending review, it's a relatively new tool. Spending review, it's a tool that governments have used typically since the financial crisis, and its focus is often on efficiency savings. And I think that the sort of focus on efficiency savings maybe means that countries haven't got an eye towards gender equality at that time. And so yeah, I think it's about the purpose of spending review in that case, and it's going to take a while for governments to understand how they can both take into account efficiency savings and gender equality at the same time when undertaking activities such as spending review. So I hopefully, although there are different reasons, hopefully I think that will give a little bit of a indication as why only a few countries are using these tools.
I'll pass on to our second question. The OECD typology of gender budgeting focuses on the usage of analytical tools, ex ante, concurrent, and ex post. Does it mean that a gender-responsive budgeting initiative always requires the usage of certain tools?
It's another interesting question. I think yes, it's the tools and approaches that are put in place that are the building blocks of a gender-responsive budgeting initiative, and it's important that any government who's doing gender-responsive budgeting has tools that ensure that there is gender-responsive budgeting efforts across all those 3 stages of the budget. So yes, I would say it does always require the usage of certain tools, and it always requires the usage of tools in each of these stages of the budget.
Our third question is, why is the ex-ante gender impact assessment the most recurrent tool? Is it the most effective one? Can it be linked to the gender needs assessment?
Yeah, I think that typically countries, when they are developing policies, they might undertake regulatory impact assessments, which are assessments of the policy and the impact of that policy on different regulations. And I think that the gender assessment part of that has been, a gender assessment has been built into a lot of these regulatory impact assessments. So it's very much a historic procedure, this type of policy assessment that countries have been doing, and I think a gender perspective has been added to it over time. So it's the fact that it was already quite an embedded tool. And is it the most effective one? I really have no idea. I mean, I don't think, I think that some gender impact assessments are done in a very light touch way. You know, it depends on the quality of the impact assessments. Some countries or some managers who are undertaking this work will just, you know, think very quickly about the extent to which the policy might have an impact on gender, and others might have a much more thorough approach to this sort of impact assessment. So the extent to which it's effective really depends on how seriously the individual managers are in taking into account the gender perspective as they do it. And I would suspect that there's a range of effectiveness in that respect. Can it be linked to gender needs assessment? Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it could be. No, it could be linked to gender needs assessment. You know, using, in particular, like the use of gender disaggregated data is in understanding the extent to which the policy is going to have an impact on men and women differently is important for both needs-based analysis and gender impact assessments. So there is definitely, there could definitely be a link there.
Our fourth question. Sweden is one of the countries with significant data available. However, the presentation says that in one of the countries without information and evidence for measuring the actual impact of gender budgeting. How is that possible?
Yeah, oh, sorry, did you want to say anything else on that?
No, go ahead, go ahead.
I think perhaps one of the important things to think about when we analyze OECD surveys is to recognize that this is government's own perspectives on their countries. And Sweden, you know, set a particularly high bar in relation to their gender budgeting efforts. And so it may be, for example, that they don't feel that they've got the information and evidence that they would like to have in relation to measuring the actual impact of gender budgeting yet. So it's really like it's quite a judgmental. There's an element of judgment involved, I would say, in terms of how countries report, and certainly I think this reflects the fact that Sweden would want to have a greater understanding of the impact of gender budgeting. So it could even be a reflection of, you know, how ambitious the Swedes are in this area, that they have said that they have not enough information and evidence for measuring gender budgeting so far.
Our fifth question asks Sigrid, I am surprised that parliamentary review is so important in gender impact assessment. Can you give some examples? Maybe this is not seen often in developing countries as there are not many women as MPs yet.
Okay, let me see if I have any examples to hand. I may have an example to hand. Let me see. But yeah, I think, hold on, I'm just going to look at my notes to see if I can find an example. Here it is. So I wouldn't say that parliamentary review is any more important in the area of gender budgeting than it is in any area. I think that the reason we say it's important is because we believe that parliamentary review is an integral aspect of overall public financial management. And it's through, if you think about Parliament being the democratic voice of the people, then Parliament can be a channel through which the people that have been elected to represent citizens oversee the government efforts and assess whether or not they're in line with citizens' demands and citizens' needs. And it's this check and balance that's really important in terms of ensuring that the government does its work more effectively, and that it has not got uncontrolled powers that in this area, and so it's really about ensuring that there's checks and balances on all government activity rather than gender budgeting in particular. And so that's why parliamentary review is important. I wouldn't say, hopefully it wouldn't depend on how many women are MPs. It just really depends on the extent to which the government has stated objectives in this area that the Parliament should be checking that the government is performing against. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
I'll pass on to the sixth question by Sarah. Terrific presentation, very clear and comprehensive. I had the same question as Sigrid. Is it because of political opportunity of showing the results? So maybe if you could add a little more to the previous question.
Yeah, I think that it's not so much about political opportunity of showing the results, although it is important that the results are communicated with the public, and that good results and bad results are understood. But I really think it's more about ensuring that the work of the government is scrutinized. and that there are procedures in place to ensure that there are checks on the government work, and that's what the parliamentary role really is.
Great. I'll pass on to the 7th question. In the OECD, what are the next planned steps for supporting GRB work, gender responsive budgeting work? Yes.
So as I mentioned, we're just in the process of finalizing a gender budgeting toolkit, which outlines the key gender budgeting tools that governments could consider, why they're important, and what the pitfalls are to avoid with these tools. So we'll be publishing that later in the year, and then we'll be moving forward in terms of supporting and facilitating countries in getting a better understanding of the impact of gender budgeting. I think it's important to understand the impact for a number of reasons. A, because there's still some cynicism with regard to gender budgeting that exists, and some people view it as a fad, some people don't understand why it's important, and I think that having evidence of impact and showing that it brings about societal and economic improvements is critical in terms of getting the buy-in for gender budgeting going forward. So we'll be focusing a lot of efforts in this area, and we're also going to be doing a number of country reviews, reviewing gender budgeting practices in specific OECD countries and making suggestions for improvement, and hopefully in the longer term we might develop some best practices or principles for gender budgeting for governments across the OECD.
Our 8th question, do all OECD countries have a systematic adoption of monitoring and evaluation, M&E, where we can mainstream gender?
So I think we see at the moment it's like 26 countries have got a performance sort of framework in place, 26 out of 35. So kind of 2/3 of OECD countries have got a performance management framework in place. And I've lost the question. Sorry.
I put it up and shared it.
Yeah, and so yes, I think that not all countries do, but most countries do, and so there are great opportunities for mainstreaming gender monitoring and evaluation within these frameworks.
Okay. Next question. Have any of the OECD countries developed a gender responsive budgeting policy note as a tool to guide the government in the process of mainstreaming gender into planning, budgeting, monitoring, and evaluation cycle?
Yes, they have. For example, if I can go back, like I know a number of countries have got guidelines in relation to the implementation of gender budgeting tools that they have that they use as part of their gender budgeting approach, and these guidelines help ensure a consistency approach across line ministries and ensure buy-in from the different actors that are involved in gender budgeting. So I think maybe rather than policy notes, a lot of them have developed sort of guidance manuals for managers, budget managers, program managers, to ensure a consistent approach to gender budgeting across. And then what's in I think that's the answer to that question.
Great. Question number 10. Have you come across it reads of doing gender audit in any of the OECD countries? What were the major challenges? How did you overcome it?
Okay, so gender audit. I think the challenges, yes, we do come across gender audit. I think I mentioned the example of Andalusia in Spain, where they're particularly strong in this area, and you'll see some information online on that. I think with the challenges of gender audit are the same as the challenges of many audits, and that's, you know, attributing the changes to the specific policy, you know, is one of the key challenges. Having the right, making sure that you've had the right measures in place to see whether there's progress, and you've got the right information to help you understand why, you know, whether performance has improved or not. And also, you know, with the time lag of getting the results, being able to feed in audit findings into the next policy development cycle is quite difficult sometimes, because you might be running with data that's 2 or 3 years out of date, and it's kind of like trying to drive the car by looking in the rear view mirror. And so that's one of the challenges with any audit, and so you would experience that with gender audit as well. How you overcome it is really about having good indicators. It's about having producing audit findings that are timely, and it's about ensuring that audit findings are fed into the policy development cycle and not standalone.
We lost you for a little bit. Do you mind repeating the last part of your response?
Yeah, it's just about, so how do you overcome the challenges of gender audit? Well, it's the same as how you would overcome the challenges of any audit. It's about ensuring you've got the right indicators in place. It's about ensuring that you have got timely audit that's undertaken, you know, quickly, published quickly, as soon as the data is available. It's about ensuring that the audit findings are fed into the policy development cycle and don't exist as a standalone element.
Great. Question number 11 asks Flora, do you think it's best for OECD countries to implement at least one typology of gender budgeting in the ex-ante, concurrent, and ex-post, or just one tool in general is more than enough?
I think that what tools are used is really specific to the country context. There's a lot of different budget, you know, a lot of different ways in which the budget is managed in different OECD countries, and so the tools that are the most relevant will differ in different countries. But I think, so I wouldn't be held to saying, you know, one tool in each is enough, but I think all I would say is it's important that there are tools that that cover each stage of the budget cycle, whether that's one or more. I wouldn't be drawn to say, but it's dependent on the country circumstance.
Great. Elizabeth asks, you mentioned that gender audits allow to identify best practices. Do you have examples on how those best practices have been used to do advocacy?
So I don't think I have specific examples of how those best practices have been used to do advocacy. I think that what would I say? I think I've got examples of how best practices in general have been used to do advocacy. You know, in Iceland recently, we heard about how the government has been applying a gender perspective to its resource allocation, and you know the significant changes that the government has, the significant changes to policy that's brought about as a result. And I think, for example, you know, they realized that the local government level, they wanted to build football stadiums, but they realized that when they did a gender impact assessment of it, that the football stadiums were really going to benefit mostly middle-aged men, and so there really wasn't a big gender balance in terms of the effect of this spend, and so they really rethought how they would spend that money instead, and in addition they've got certain constraints in terms of, you know, the women's and the men's football teams have to be funded equally, and you're seeing significant results by the women's football team in Iceland. And I think these sort of grassroots stories about how gender budgeting is changing policy developments in key areas and resulting in and delivering impressive results in terms of gender equality is a good example of how other people can be persuaded to take on board the same gender perspective in their area of work as well.
Our next question asks Flora, do you think we should also make gender statistics by default in OECD countries? A sex disaggregated data alone does not guarantee, for example, that the data collection instruments involved in the data production were conceived to reflect gender roles, relations, and inequalities in society.
Yeah, there's definitely improvements that we need to make in terms of the collection of sex disaggregated data. I think that we're not yet at the stage of having being in the privileged position to understand why gender disaggregated data is insufficient, because we're still at the stage where we don't have sufficient gender disaggregated data to be able to make that judgment. So I think it's iterative. You know, first we need to have improvements to the quantity of gender disaggregated data, and then we need to ensure that the data that we have is good quality as well. So it's two different aspects that we need to improve, both the quantity and the quality, and I think that we're still at the stage where we need to improve the quantity, and so a lot of the focus is on that.
Great, and now I will pass on to our last question, unless anyone else has any final questions or remarks. And this question is by Elizabeth. You mentioned that an impact identified by Korea is an increased gender equality awareness of government servants. Do you know if and where we can find good practices on training on gender responsive budgeting?
I'm actually not aware of anywhere where there's good practices on training in relation to gender responsive budgeting, but I think that it is a really important element, and I don't have any to hand, but it's not to say that you know, through contacting individual countries I couldn't come across it, but it's not something that I've delved into yet, I have to admit. So yeah, I would need to get back to you on that, I'm afraid. I don't have the answer to hand.
Well, we have reached the end of our questions, and I will pass the microphone on now.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Nicole. You were very patient and responded to all those questions. It was very interesting. I will leave the mic to Marga so she can do a recap, and then we can finalize. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sherry, very, very much for your presentation. It was a masterclass, especially on GRB tools, so we really appreciate all this information. I'm glad to see that the video is recorded so we can access to it later. So let me summarize what we have told today before we finish, very briefly, because we're running out of time. I will say that in recent years, a momentum has been observed across the OECD countries in the area of gender budgeting. As we have seen, the OECD has a particular typology of gender budgeting with these three categories: ex ante, concurrent, and ex post tools. So we can see a differentiated approach to gender budgeting across the countries. Currently, there is a stronger emphasis on ex ante gender impact assessment as the key tool of gender budgeting, and fewer countries use gender needs assessments, gender audits, and spending reviews. And finally, going forward, improved availability of sex disaggregated data and improved understanding of the impact on gender budgeting is crucial to make gender budgeting work. So thank you again, Sherry. We look forward to reading the upcoming publications and to learn more about the analytical work that the OECD is doing. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time in your schedule for today's conference. So bye-bye from Madrid and enjoy the weekend.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole, Sherry, sorry. And I wish you a good weekend, as it's Friday today.
Thank you.
Thank you again, and I hope we keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.